Well, we're continuing this morning in what is really one of my favorite books in the Old Testament. I might need a few minutes at the end. We're running a little bit late, and this is a big story, but it's really a great story. As we continue on our journey down Route 66, we're actually coming this morning to the end of that second leg, what I've got us doing today is pulling right up to the state line, our last Sunday in Missouri, and then next Sunday we'll head off into Kansas. And were you to actually take the drive down old Route 66, when you got right here to the intersection of the state line of Kansas and Missouri and where Route 66 crosses it, there's really only one place you can stop, and that is at the Hogs and Hot Rods Saloon. So, you might want to kind of plan on this. It doesn't look like much from the outside, but a couple of things about this. Number one is right in front of it, that's, as the road goes by, that's Route 66, and that white line on the right-hand side is Missouri, on the left-hand side is Kansas, sits right out in front of that saloon. And as I was doing a little bit of research, it was fascinating because I found a picture inside, and Gene Clark will love this because what these guys are doing is they are scoring their very own Hogs and Hot Rods chili cook-off. I mean, hey, you see how all this goes together? I mean, we have just got this whole thing so planned. No. Anyway, so we hope that you, again, will hop in with us on our own chili cook-off. But I thought that was kind of funny that would be going on right there. And if you go down Route 66, apparently it's right around the 1st of August, like a lot of these festivals. Our corresponding book in the Bible is the book of Esther. And again, great book, the last book of Old Testament history, although what I'll show you in just a minute is chronologically it's not actually the last book, but in terms of the way your Bibles are set up, it is the last book. And it's a great story. If you were to capture the theme of the entire book, I would say the theme of the book is deliverance from destruction. And by the way, one of the fascinating things about that theme is that the word that is used in your Bible, particularly in the New Testament, that is translated salvation, soteria, or sozo is the verb form of that. The literal meaning of salvation is deliverance from destruction. So in a sense, this is a book about salvation, and particularly what we're going to see about the salvation of the Jewish nation. Let me read you a couple of verses right out of the beginning of the book of Esther. It starts out this way. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled over provinces stretching from India to Cush. And at that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials, the military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. This, let me set a little bit of a context for the book of Esther, and you notice that historically we're told it takes place during the reign of Xerxes. Again, it's part of the Old Testament story of the return from captivity, and Esther sits right in between, chronologically, between the content of the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah. So Ezra first comes, if we can date that based on, again, what the text says, he first comes back to Jerusalem in about 458 BC, and Nehemiah is sent back in 445 BC, and right in that little range there, the events of the book of Esther take place. When you look, basically what we're looking at some of the last few books of history in terms of the captivity, we're really looking at what happens to those Jews that come out of captivity and return to the land of Israel. But the question might be asked, well, what about those that don't return? I mean, what's going on out there with and really the remnant that returns is really a very small portion of the people that were deported. And at this point in time, those that were deported are really living all over the Persian Empire. And this is a book that tells us something of great significance that took place among those that didn't return from exile. It's really the story of how nearly all of them were killed, and actually not only all of them killed, but the more I thought about it, well, actually even those that returned out of exile are still part of the Persian Empire, but it's a story of how a near Holocaust takes place. And really two big divisions of the book, if you can kind of remember this, you'll know how the book really breaks down. The first part is the plot that gets hatched to destroy all of the Jews. And then the second part of the book is the plan that gets devised that saves them or delivers them. And we'll look at both of those this morning. So the plot. We're told here in the text, again, this takes place at the time of Xerxes. Now, Xerxes, in terms of thinking about these Persian emperors, Xerxes was the son of Darius. And remember, it's during the reign of Darius that the temple is rebuilt. And so, if you go back and look at the text, it'll say a certain year, the 20th year of Darius or whatever. He's the grandson of Cyrus the Great, who sends the first wave back to reoccupy the land. And he's the father of Artaxerxes. And if you remember from last week, it's Artaxerxes who is the king of the Persian Empire when Nehemiah is sent back to rebuild the walls. This takes place and begins, we're told, in the third year of the reign of King Xerxes, and basically we think that probably is right around 483 BC. And it begins with a little bit of what you might think of as a backstory to getting to where this whole story of the salvation of the Jews takes place. It takes place when Xerxes, he throws this huge bash. And again, if you haven't read the book of Esther, which I would encourage you to do, this kind of banquet bash goes on for 6 months, 180 days party. This king, he knew how to throw a party, okay? And he has all of his military leaders in and the rulers of the provinces, and you sort of get an idea from the text that it's all men. And at the end of 180 days, then he throws another celebration for 7 days for everybody that lives in Susa. And sort of to paraphrase, the text, it's like an open bar during the 7 days. And so it's probably a relatively rowdy event going on. And at the end of those 7 days, he comes up with this idea, Xerxes there, that's what I'm going to use for Xerxes, that he wants to show off his queen. And so we read in the text that on the 7th day, this is of the little 7-day event at the end of the 180 days, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. So, he calls for the queen to come, and we're told she's very beautiful. And this is actually a Persian beauty here, and I like the picture because it kind of looks like maybe she's got her crown on. It's interesting that what's going to happen here, you probably already know, she's not going to come, which you might ask, well, that's pretty stupid, I mean, why would she do that when you see the consequences? But it's fascinating because some of the early rabbis actually, when they were writing about the book of Esther, point out the fact that when it is mentioned that she was wearing her crown, the sense of that is that that's all she was wearing. And so and by the way, this seemed to be not an unusual practice in terms of showing off your wife, I guess. But in this case, Xerxes, and so if that's true, you sort of understand why what happens next happens, which is that Vashti refuses to come. So when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. And the result is that Xerxes, we're told, becomes furious and burns with anger. Now, I would suggest that when you lived in Persia in the 5th century BC and your husband was the ruler of the most powerful empire the world would ever known, and he's got all of his buddies with him, it's not the time to refuse what he tells you to do. And so he's really angry about this, and he seeks counsel. And basically, there's a couple of verses in the text. He seeks counsel, and this is what his counselors say. Well, this very day, the Persian and Median women of nobility, they've heard about what the queen did. And they'll respond to all the king's nobles in the same way, and there'll be no end of disrespect and discord. By the way, doesn't this sound like nothing ever changes, in the entire world, So what they're really afraid of is not simply that she said no, but that it's going to catch on, all right? And so he's given advice, again, by his counselors. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women. And so they'll despise their husbands, and they'll say, well, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she wouldn't come. It wasn't very good, was it? Anyway, all right. So you get the sense. So the two things are this, that first of all, what they're going to say to him is depose her, or the other women will become problematic like she is. And then the second thing that they're going to tell him is they're going to tell him, find another to take her place. And again, this is a part of the first part. Then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. In other words, you're going to put the fear into the women of the empire if not even the queen can, say no to her husband. Now, it goes on, and they come up with this idea. Then the king's personal attendants propose, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king, and let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. So a search is going to be made, a search for a new queen, and it's going to take place across the entire Persian Empire. I think this goes along with that. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. So again, looking for a replacement there. And this advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. So this search begins across the whole Persian Empire. This gives you a little sense of the scope of the Persian Empire at the time that Xerxes reigned and ruled. So there were 20 provinces and 127 smaller divisions inside those provinces, and the message goes out to the entire empire that in every one of these 127 smaller little divisions to find the most beautiful women you can and bring them here to Susa, the capital, which is where the little red star is, the capital of the empire. And what they're told is that when they come, they're going to be put, first of all, into the harem of the king, which would have been primarily where his concubines were kept. But these women are vying not to be a concubine, but of course to become the queen. And then we're simply told they're going to be given beauty treatments. And then at the end of them, being beautified, you pick the one that you want to replace Vashti. And we're simply told in the text that many young women are brought to the citadel. Now, at that point in the story, we get introduced to our heroine of the story, and that is we get introduced to Esther. And we're told this, Mordecai, who is one of the main players we'll be looking at as we move along, had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. And this young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. So she is a Jewess, and her Jewish name is Hadassah, but she has a Persian name also. And Esther is really her Persian name, which simply means star. And she was an orphan, we're told, and she is raised by her cousin Mordecai, and you get a sense he's probably, obviously, older than she is. And in the text, we're told that Mordecai comes from the tribe of Benjamin. Really, the captives either came from Judah or Benjamin or the tribe of Levi. And Benjamin, of course, was the tribe that we would trace back to King Saul. But he was a descendant of exiles. And we goes on, and we're simply told that she was beautiful. And actually, the text is kind of interesting because it says that she had a lovely figure and was beautiful. So we need to find a good Esther. So this is a Jewish beauty here, and we'll use her this morning as our Esther. And she gets picked. She lives in Susa, by the way, so she's kind of right there in the capital. And she gets picked to sort of be part of this, I don't know what to call it, contest, pageant, whatever you want to call it. We aren't exactly told how she gets picked, but we're told that she is picked. And when she is picked to be a part of this, Mordecai tells her not to reveal that she is a Jew. And obviously, we're going to see why as time moves on. She goes through this year of beauty treatments. We're told that for 6 months, the ladies are sort of treated with oil and myrrh, and then the second 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics, and then one by one, they're sort of sent in to the king to see which one he will favor to be queen. We're told in the text that Esther actually sort of wins the favor of the one that's in charge of the harem, a eunuch, and eventually she gets taken to the king. When we look at the dates on this, by the way, it's been roughly 4 years since that event when Xerxes has deposed Vashti, and so little time has elapsed, but we're basically told that Esther, she wins the contest. And we're told that the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women. She won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins, so he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So we've got the kind of whole backstory set up now. Esther has, been placed into this position of incredible prominence as the queen. And then we're introduced to this plot. And the villain of the story is a guy by the name of Haman. And here's what we're told about him. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all other nobles. Now, an Agagite was a subset of the Amalekites. And you might remember that they trace their descent back to a king of the Amalekites called Agag. You remember this? And Agag is the guy that when Saul was told to, take the whole bunch out, he didn't obey, and he spared the king, and then, of course, and some of the finest, of the livestock, etc. And when Samuel the prophet came, you'll probably remember, and Saul sort of said, "Hey, I've done everything the Lord told me to do." And that famous sort of line from Samuel, "Well, what then is this bleating of sheep in my ears?" And he hadn't been obedient. And in that particular part of the history of Israel, Samuel the prophet then actually puts Agag to death. But Haman traces his lineage back. He's part of the descendants of Agag and part of the Amalekites, and they were known to be perpetual enemies of the Jews. They actually fought against the Jews when they were coming in the time of the Exodus and were coming to inherit the land. And rather than assisting them, they tried to resist them. And in the book of Deuteronomy, it states that they were to be perpetual enemies of the Jews. And I think that sort of ties in to what's getting ready to happen here in the story. So, Haman, he's raised to this position, kind of like the prime minister of the Persian Empire. He's like the number 2 guy under the king, and we're told that everybody was to pay honor to him. So all the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him, but Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. And again, probably somehow tied into the fact that the law of Israel said these are your perpetual enemies, and you're not to pay them honor. So what happens is that Mordecai now gets enraged about all of this, and he comes up with this plot. Let's see what we got here. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai, and instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. And so this plot is hatched. It's a holocaust. It is this attempt to completely wipe out what is left of the nation of Israel. Every Jew in the empire is to be killed. Now, let me pause for a second and make an observation that's not in the text. When I see this, one of the first things that comes to my mind is a verse from Revelation. And for those of you that went through Revelation with you might remember that in chapter 12 there is an apocalyptic image or vision given of Satan. He's a dragon that John sees, this dragon, and the dragon is pursuing a woman. And as we went through the text, it became obvious that the woman was a symbol of the nation of Israel. And there's really this sense that throughout history, and what we're told in the text is the dragon pursues the woman. And I think that there's a lot of behind the scenes at a spiritual level, things going on in the realm of principalities and powers, that unseen universe, where there is an attempt to destroy the nation of Israel. I think it is, particular up to the time of Christ, I think it's really an attempt by Satan to keep Jesus from being born. So what happens if this plot, well, first of all, go back, think about what happened in Egypt. Okay, so Pharaoh's going to try, and every male child, is going to be killed, and he's going to basically, try and shut down the growth of the Jewish people there in Egypt. And you get this sense that part of what's going on behind the scenes, it's an attempt to keep the Messiah from being born. And I think that that's what's going on here at a spiritual level. And I actually think it's kind of the takeaway from this first part, that this is a particular time when the dragon is pursuing the woman. And in the same way, of course, the book of Revelation says that she bears a son, and the son is a male child, which is, again, a reference to Jesus Christ, and that the dragon pursues the son and his offspring, which is us. And again, when Paul talks about that, our battles oftentimes aren't with flesh and blood, but with the unseen universe, principalities and powers he talks about. We wrestle against them. And you look at this story that's going on, and honestly, well, we kind of know the end of the story, but at this point in time, the Jews don't know what's really going on here. All they know is that this decree, well, actually it hasn't been issued yet, but when it gets issued, that this decree happens and that they are in danger of being annihilated. Well, again, did I do this? Let me see. Okay, I'll go back here a second. So here's what happens. He decides he's going to kill all of the Jews along with Mordecai, and he goes to determine when am I going to do this? And in what was not uncommon in that period of history in many nations, actually including Israel, they decide he's going to cast lots to come up with a date. And in this text, the lot is referred to as a pur, okay, P-U-R, a pur. And we know that historically, the lots or purs, left-hand side is an example of this. Sometimes they sort of had a look much like a dice might have. Other times the lot would be a series of stones, sometimes sticks with that had letters on them, and it was a way of trying to foretell what was the right decision, what was the wrong decision, and just to give you a little bit of a sense of just of size here, these are stones again that are being cast, and in this case they have letters on them. And Haman cast lots or cast the pur to come up with a date when this event of the annihilation of the Jewish people would take place. And a date is arrived at. By the way, these are all references in the scriptures to casting lots to make a decision. So again, it was somewhat of a common practice. The idea was that somehow that when you cast the lot, God would make the right decision come up. It's pre-Pentecost. It's not a good way for us to make decisions. We're supposed to allow the Holy Spirit to guide us and God to sort of speak to us. But just so you know, this was not an uncommon thing even among the people of God, but all pre-Pentecost. So he cast the lot. He cast the pur. And again, without knowing specifically how this happened, he gets a date. And the date that comes up, and this is taking place right around 474 BC, and the date that comes up is that it will be the 12th month of the year, so it's actually going to take us into the year 473 BC, and that on this date, in this last month of the Jewish year, that all of the Jews within the Persian Empire are going to be subject to being annihilated. And he sells the plot to Xerxes. Now, if you read the text carefully, you'll notice a couple of things. One is he really slanders the Jews. He tells Xerxes that there's a people in his empire that resist him all the time, and they're always being problematic, but what he doesn't say is that it's the Jews that he's talking about. So Xerxes doesn't even know exactly who these people are, but Xerxes buys in to this particular plot, and not only does Haman sort of sell the plot, he offers to fund it, out of his own resources, and this massive amount of silver that he offers to fund the destruction. And so finally, Xerxes orders a decree. And the decree goes something like this. Oh, this is him offering to pay for it. Let's go on here. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. And so this decree, it goes out. All the Jews are going to be annihilated, and we think that the date that corresponds to that would have been March 7th, 473 BC. But it's a little ways away. Actually, when the pur is cast, they're in the first month of the year. So there's about 11 months between the time that this decision is made and the day is going to come. And of course, the rest of our story takes place between those two events. So it'll be a day of holocaust and plunder. And again, I think this is where I said the takeaway. Again, the dragon pursues the woman. It's a spiritual dynamic there and getting worked out again in this particular incident. Well, it's almost like when that happens, it's like we've just come to the end of the first act of the story, and then the second act begins. So that's the plot. And so the first 3 chapters of Esther all have to do with the backstory and how this plot gets devised. And then the rest of the book really has to do with this plan that Mordecai and Esther come up with in order to save the Jews. Now, previous to what we're getting ready to look at, I'll just throw this in because I didn't go into it. Early in the book, there's a little incident that you're told about that you don't know the significance of, but you're about to find out in the story. And that is that earlier in the book, we're told that Mordecai one day was at the gate of the city and he overheard a conversation between 2 of the nobles that were plotting to kill Xerxes. And Mordecai tells Esther about it. Esther tells Xerxes, and basically Mordecai saves Xerxes' life. But what we're going to see is that nothing was ever done about that, but it got recorded in the history of the king, the annals of the king, this little incident, and sort of keep that in the back of your mind here, all right? So, Mordecai is extremely distressed, and he puts on sackcloth and ashes and calls all over the empire for a time of fasting and mourning. And then he sends the decree to Esther so that she can see it. Here's what's getting ready to happen. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he's sending a messenger to him, and he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and to plead with him for her people. Now, at this point, a couple of things happen. First of all, Esther is going to remind Mordecai that if she goes in and approaches the king without being summoned, she can be put to death. This was something you flat didn't do. And then there's 2 great texts here, and you probably are familiar with them. You might not know this is where they are, but 2 great texts, because Mordecai then says to her, who knows but that you have come to the kingdom, and probably a better translation is that you have been raised to a royal position for such a time as this. Now, again, if you think back to this whole search and her becoming queen and everything, she didn't really know. Did God have some big purpose or plan for this? Again, it's one of those situations where God is working in a way that isn't quite as overt as when he sends Moses and unleashes 10 plagues, on the nation of Egypt. But he's working this whole time behind the scenes. My phrase is always, there's this divine orchestration going on, but they don't see it, all right? They don't see it. But Mordecai is saying, boy, we've got this situation where all of the Jews are going to be annihilated, and you have an opportunity to do something, and maybe that's the exact reason why you've ended up in the position that you're in. And Esther responds to that. She calls out for Mordecai to put out a call again for fasting and prayer, and she responds to him, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law, and if I perish, I perish. In other words, I'll do it, and it could cost me my life, but I will do it. So Esther comes up with a plan. And we're told again in the text that she comes up with this plan. She puts on her royal robes, and she positions herself in a way that she's not going in and violating that fact that she is not to approach the king unless he summons her. But she sort of, maneuvers herself into a place where the king can see her. And, she's probably a little spiffed up at this point in time. And so Xerxes sees her and he calls her in. So already things are starting to go well in terms of her attempt to do what she can do. And when he calls her in, he's pleased with her, and he asks her what she wants. And then this little phrase will appear a couple of times, even up to half the kingdom. What do you want? Now, if Esther was a guy, she'd go, give me the half kingdom, right? Anyway, I think this is something only a really smart woman could have come up with, okay? And so what does she ask? Up to half the kingdom. And she says, well, all I really want is you to come over for lunch. This is kind of what it says. I want to throw a banquet for you. And by the way, why don't you bring Haman along with you? Now, at the banquet, they come and she's, put out the spread for her. And Xerxes asks again, what do you want? Up to half the kingdom. And Esther says, what I'd really like? Would you come back tomorrow for another banquet? That's all I want, really, And again, very subtle in what she is doing. Now, in the meantime, what we're told is, Haman's feeling pretty good about this point in time. Everything is going great for him, except that when he sees Mordecai, and Mordecai won't bow down, it sort of ruins the whole deal for him. And he gets enraged, we're told. So he goes home, he calls his wife and his friends in, and the text tells us, he tells them how great everything's going. And not only is everything going great, but he is the only person other than the king that's been invited to these banquets that Esther has thrown. And he's real proud about that at this point in time. But then he tells them, but Mordecai is just ruining the whole thing. And so his wife comes up with a little plan. And I'm going to tell you what I think the text should be translated. Your text talks about a gallows that's going to be built, and then a 75-foot high gallows, and that he is to have Mordecai hung from the gallows. Well, the Persians didn't hang people in the same way that we're thinking of, and that they didn't build a gallows. And the Hebrew text actually is very, not obscure, but it basically says, build a wooden thing 75 feet high. So wood is the essence of the word there, and then hang Mordecai on it. But what we really know in terms of how the Persians operated is that it was basically a spike, and that they impaled people. That's how they, quote, hung them. They impaled them on a spike, and this one, appears to have been one heck of a spike, 7 stories high, so that everybody could see what went on. So he likes that idea. He likes that idea. Now, just about this time is where the story takes a little bit of a twist, okay? That night, Xerxes can't sleep. Now again, I think this is God's hand here a bit. He can't sleep, so what does he do? He has his own history brought out. Read me my history a little bit. And so the annals of the king are brought out, and again, what I would believe is divine engineering. Others would think, oh, look at the that was just, kind of circumstance there. They begin to read to him, and they read the part about when Mordecai saved his life. And then he finds out nothing has ever been done to reward Mordecai for saving his life. And he starts trying to figure out, what should I do? And apparently he has servants there, and it's nighttime. It's late, and he says, is there anybody here that could give me counsel? Well, there's only one guy that's there, and that's Haman. Because Haman's on his way, to pitch the deal to Xerxes about impaling Mordecai. And so he calls he calls Haman in. And I love this. And for those of you that know this story, I mean, it's so cool. It's just a God thing, okay? So he calls Haman in, and he asks him the question, what should the king do to honor the person that the king is pleased with? Well, Haman immediately thinks that Xerxes is talking about who? Him, all right? And so Haman comes up with this idea of what he would like to see happen. And so he says, well, take a robe that you've already worn and put it on the person. And then get one of the horses that you've ridden and put him on the horse, and then get a noble person and have him lead the person through the city of Susa, the capital, saying, this is what the king does for the man he's pleased with. And of course, Xerxes says, that is a great idea, and here's what I want you to do. I want you to get the robe and the horse exactly like you suggested, and then get Mordecai and put the robe on Mordecai, put him on the horse, and by the way, you're already here, so why don't you be the noble that then leads him through the city of Susa? And, you got to imagine what's going on. I mean, it's an absolute humiliation to Haman, but he does it. And then after he's, paraded him through the city and honored him, the king has honored him, just when it couldn't get any worse, here come the escorts to take him to lunch with Esther. And so it's the second banquet now, all right? And Esther's getting ready to unleash her plan. So the banquet's going great again, all right? It's going great. And once again, the king asks, what can I do for you? Up to half of the kingdom. And Esther simply says, well, you could spare my life and my people's lives. Now, I think that there must have been an expression on Haman's face about this point in time, because nobody knows she's a Jew. And so the king asks, well, what are you talking about? And so she tells him. She tells him that she and her people have been set up to be destroyed. And then Xerxes asks the right question. Well, who's done this? And of course, she points at Haman and says, this vile Haman. Well, Xerxes leaves in a rage. And, in the Oriental world, a lot of times they would eat sort of reclining on a couch. And apparently Esther is reclining there. And Haman, he stays behind. He's going to plead with her. So, she's on the couch and he falls on the couch pleading with her. And just as he falls on the couch to plead with her, Xerxes walks back in. And now he looks and he thinks, now you're molesting the queen. First you try and kill her, and now you're molesting her. And then one of the servants just says, by the way, there's that 75-foot stake out there. And, and he, actually Haman set that up to do that to Mordecai. And of course, Xerxes says, impale Haman. And so you have this real huge twist that takes place. Haman's put to death. The king gives Mordecai Haman's position. So now Mordecai is raised to this amazing place of authority, and he gives Haman's estate to Esther. And Mordecai becomes second in rank, only to Xerxes. Now, I should really finish now, but can you give me like 5 more minutes here? Because this looks like the end of the story, maybe. I mean, this would be a pretty good story in and of itself, right there. But we still have a big problem, because a royal decree has been issued to destroy all the Jews. And in the law of the Medes and Persians, that decree that was, the king has put his signet to it, he sealed it, that decree can't be rescinded. So what does he do? What do you do? And Xerxes says to Mordecai, you need to come up with another decree somehow, but the first can't be changed. And Mordecai comes up with quite a solution. And simply it is, well, let's let the Jews fight back. All right? And that's the decree. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. And that's his decree. The first decree is going to stand, but the second decree gives them the right to defend themselves. Well, quickly the day comes, and on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. And on this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. And in Susa, 500 enemies are killed, and the text says that throughout the empire, 75,000 enemies are killed as they attempt to annihilate the Jews, and the Jews fight back. And of course, then what happens is that a celebration is declared, and we're told again in the text that after all of this happened, Mordecai recorded these events. He sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. And that is what is declared. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. And in a little parenthetical note, we're simply told, therefore these days were called Purim, from the word pur. And for 2,491 years, every year, the Jews have celebrated this day when they were delivered from annihilation, and every time they celebrate it, at the synagogue at the first evening, the book of Esther is read, and at the synagogue the next morning, the book of Esther is read as a reminder. This year, by the way, March 11th and 12th, Jews around the world will celebrate this. And I think the takeaway is that God delivers from destruction. It's part of who He is. He saves. Let me just finish right now by saying this. 15 years after this, 15 years later, Ezra will leave for Jerusalem at the command of King Artaxerxes. And by the way, I've always wondered, so why is he so favorably disposed toward the Jews? But, you know, he lived in the palace with Esther and with Xerxes, and I think some of that is what made Artaxerxes so amenable to the Jews, perhaps. But anyway, 15 years later, Ezra will leave to build up the people, and 30 years later, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, Nehemiah will be given permission and resources to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the walls. And that brings us to the end of the historical books of the Old Testament, leg 2 of our journey down Route 66. Leg 3 will take us into Kansas, and 5 stops that correspond to the 5 books of Old Testament poetry. And next week we start out with Job. All right, let's pray. Lord, sometimes you are very overt in the things that you do. And again, we just think about miracles that you've done throughout the ages. We think about the way that you delivered the Jews from Egypt, and it was quite obvious what was going on. But Lord, you so often work incognito, and we don't see it. And right now, you're working in all of our lives and working out plans and purposes that have eternal significance. And hopefully one day we'll be able to understand all of that. But now it's just a time of trusting. And when we see the way that you kind of worked and orchestrated in the book of Esther, it's just a reminder to us, Lord, that you are working, and that you you are the one that delivers us from destruction. Not simply the physical destruction, but we think about what it meant to be apart from you, separated from you, and the hopelessness of our situation, desperate really. And Lord Jesus, through you, you have come and you've delivered us, and we're so grateful for that. We thank you for your word, this great story, and just use it in our lives to encourage us, Jesus. In your name, amen.